There now follows a short ad for my own book. Regular viewers of my channel know that I am passionate about art and spreading the word of how art can be a powerful force in our lives. My book, out now, takes you even deeper, beyond the frame. It's taken 4 years to create this book. My aim was never to rush something to market or to cash in on the channel's success. It was about creating something lasting. Something that could stand on its own as a meaningful contribution to how we experience art. Great Art Explained, the book, brings together the artists, their worlds, and the moment that shaped them. It's beautifully illustrated, designed to be read, reread, and passed on, because art doesn't just belong in galleries, it belongs to all of us. Five Napoleons, every one of them a masterpiece by Jacques-Louis David, and every one of them a lie. Jacques-Louis David was the image maker of revolutions, regimes, and empire, born into a France simmering with discontent in the build-up to revolution. His life was marked by violence, ambition, and turbulence. Disfigured in a duel as a young man, David carried the scar on his face and in his psyche for the rest of his life. He was anxious and intense, craving control in a chaotic world. He was a man of contradictions, a passionate democrat who idolized dictators, a scarred outsider who became the voice of power. He voted to execute a king, helped build the myth of a revolutionary republic, and when that republic imploded, he helped crown an emperor. Drawn repeatedly to authoritarian figures, from Robespierre and Marat to Napoleon Bonaparte, David couldn't resist the magnetic pull of power. In this video, I want to explore how David exploited art's potential to influence. He didn't just want to depict reality with his crisp neoclassical style, he wanted to shape it. His paintings became weapons of mass persuasion, so convincing that he could influence perception and even behaviour. His 1801 masterpiece, Napoleon Crossing the Alps, reveals everything about David. His obsession with power, his taste for dramatic storytelling, and how seeing is believing. This is the story of art as propaganda. Jacques-Louis David was born in 1748 into a privileged Parisian family, and his life coincided with the most tumultuous period in the history of France. Whilst the country underwent huge social and political change, David's own life had its share of drama. When he was just 9, his father was killed in a pistol duel. As a young man, Jacques-Louis also fought a duel, but with swords, leaving him with a scar across his cheek and a lasting speech impediment. He was related to François Boucher, the Rococo painter who dominated Parisian art circles. Boucher helped secure David's training under Joseph-Marie Vienne, a respected classical painter whose influence was foundational. It was Vienne who introduced David to classical clarity, moral seriousness, and historical themes. Vienne saw himself as David's mentor and later tried to rein him in, warning that too much truth is dangerous. But David ignored him completely. It could be seen as both artistic patricide and symbolic regicide, the student overthrowing the old order, just as France was about to overthrow its king. While training, David lived in the Louvre with his godfather, the comic librettist Michel-Jean Sedaine, who exposed him to the theatre world and inspired a lifelong love of drama and storytelling. It would prove to be an important influence. His gift for narrative painting was evident early on, but the upheavals of his era would transform that talent into political weaponry. By the 1760s and 70s, reformers across Europe were urging governments to modernise. France, under King Louis XVI, ironically supported America's rebellion against monarchy during the War of Independence, an expensive move that deepened the nation's debt and set a dangerous precedent. By 1787, France faced a crippling financial crisis. Ordinary people began to demand change, more freedom, more equality, and more rights. Crop failures and a brutal winter worsened the suffering, and revolution seemed inevitable. The Prix de Rome Prize was the most prestigious award for young French artists in the 18th century, a scholarship to study at the French Academy in Rome. David entered the competition 3 times and lost every time. Finally, in 1774, with this painting, he won the prize. David felt betrayed by the system with its rigid rules and hierarchical structure, and later, as the most powerful painter of revolutionary France, he effectively became the judge of artistic success, deciding who rose and who fell. A complete reversal, and perhaps a revenge for his early humiliation. Winning the prize meant David went to Rome to study the classical past, a real turning point in his art. When he arrived, his style reflected the pastel colours and soft sensuality of the Rococo. But 5 years later, he emerged a revolutionary classicist with a moral purpose. Rome changed not only his art, but his worldview. It taught him that painting could serve morality and politics, not just beauty, a lesson that would turn him into the artistic voice of the French Revolution. In Rome, he studied the Apollo Belvedere, the Lacune, and the Ara Pacis friezes, absorbing their clarity, restraint, and emphasis on civic virtue. He sketched antique statues obsessively, finding in their idealized forms an antidote to Rococo frivolity. David also studied Caravaggio in Rome, and would form a fascinating but not widely discussed cross-century connection. In the same way Caravaggio had rebelled against mannerism, David's generation was rebelling against Rococo artists like Boucher and Fragonard. In works like The Death of Marat, he channels Caravaggio's realism. The corpse is starkly lit, the textures of skin and blood unflinching, and the setting austere. Beneath their stylistic differences lies a shared understanding of theatricality, light, and persuasion. David may have rejected Caravaggio's style, but he absolutely inherited his psychological and dramatic power. David's use of light in Napoleon Crossing the Alps owes much to Caravaggio's tenebrism, the control of light and shadow to heighten focus and drama. Look at the way Napoleon's face and cloak are brilliantly lit against the stormy darkness of the mountains. This isn't natural daylight. It's like a theatre spotlight. It's a symbolic illumination, a painter's light that declares Napoleon as the chosen one, in the same way Caravaggio's beam falls on St. Paul or St. Matthew. The Italian artist was known for compressing narrative into a single charged moment. David, too, looked for that extreme concentration of drama, every gesture and object precise, every surface stripped of excess. Without distraction, we focus on the figures. In Napoleon Crossing the Alps, the rearing horse, the billowing cloak, and Napoleon's raised arm all combine to create a moment of theatrical, suspended tension. On his return to Paris in 1780, David emerged as a rising star. At the Salon, his brand of crisp, severe neoclassicism was a breath of fresh air after the sugary Rococo. In 1782, he married Marguerite Charlotte Pécule, a moderate thinker who came from a royalist-leaning family but who supported the revolution. As we shall see later, hers would turn out to be an important and consistent voice when David was led astray by powerful dogma. When Louis XVI's government commissioned the Oath of the Hierarchi in 1784, a few years after his time in Rome, David was ready. and it became the definitive statement of his neoclassical vision, the culmination of everything the city had taught him. David's storytelling ability captured the heart and spirit of a nation, and his love of theatre was a driving force. Backdrops were laid out like theatre sets, figures like actors on a stage. He used frontal staging, rhythmic gestures, and lighting like a spotlight to focus the viewer's attention. Every column, costume, and gesture was rooted in archaeological precision. It's a painting that feels less like a picture than a play. The brothers stand like actors, their arms outstretched in a choreographed salute. The stone arches rise like a proscenium arch on a stage. The audience is not in ancient Rome, it's right here, watching virtue performed on a stage. David would take the ideas he learned from this royal commission and apply them not only to his portraits of revolutionaries, but also to his portrait of an authoritarian emperor. The Revolution of 1789 promised a new, less hierarchical society. Crowds overthrew the Ancien Regime, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed liberty, security, and resistance to oppression as natural rights. By 1792, however, the revolution took a darker turn. After the monarchy's abolition, a close vote in January 1793 condemned King Louis XVI to death. His execution radicalized the movement and deepened division. Angry mobs filled the street, and the Jacobins, an extremist faction led by Robespierre and the so-called Committee of Public Safety, launched the Reign of Terror, in which an estimated 17,000 people were officially executed, mostly by guillotine, while approximately 10,000 more died in prison or without trial. It's important to understand that David was not just a sympathizer of the revolution, but one of its most radical and active participants. In this painting, David explored the sacrifice of family for civic duty, reflecting the moral rigor he admired in revolutionary leaders. By 1793, however, he was glorifying a murdered Jacobin in The Death of Marat, portraying Marat, the architect of the September massacres, as a heroic martyr. But his extremism wasn't just political, it was personal. He sought purity in art and life, hated compromise, and was drawn to figures of authority and conviction, from Socrates to Robespierre to Napoleon. His fanaticism was aesthetic as much as ideological. He wanted clarity, order, and moral absolutes in a chaotic world. David even voted for the king's execution. He co-signed hundreds of arrest warrants during the terror, including some for his former friends and patrons. After Robespierre's downfall in 1794, David was imprisoned for a year. He later described it as a period of reflection and repentance, though not of complete regret. His ex-wife Charlotte visited him and in fact helped secure his release. In gratitude, David painted The Intervention of the Sabine Women, depicting women halting a war between their husbands and their fathers and brothers. It was a symbol of reconciliation and peace, and the couple remarried in 1796. He then gradually aligned himself with the new powerhouse, Napoleon Bonaparte, transferring his faith in revolutionary virtue to imperial authority. Napoleon Bonaparte was an extraordinary talent. A military genius, he combined ruthless pragmatism with visionary intelligence, reshaping not only the map of Europe, but also the very idea of leadership. Few figures in history so completely embodied both brilliance and willpower. Without the French Revolution, there would almost certainly have been no Napoleon as we know him. As a low-born artillery officer with no noble connections, Napoleon would have remained a minor provincial soldier, competent but invisible. Born in Corsica in 1769, Napoleon rose rapidly through the military, brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless. He transformed himself from a provincial outsider, born without wealth, noble title, or political connections, to hero. seizing control of a revolution that was supposed to abolish tyranny, and then crowning himself emperor, all within a decade. Napoleon understood the power of imagery, and he knew that David's brush could turn military triumph into myth, just as Renaissance popes had used Michelangelo or Raphael to sanctify their rule. And so, around 1800, Napoleon commissioned David to paint an image celebrating his victory in the Battle of Marengo. It would become the most iconic portrait of the great military leader. The Battle of Marengo took place on the 14th of June 1800 in northern Italy. It was a decisive victory for Napoleon against the Austrian army. The battle would pave the way for the French Empire and was the moment Napoleon's legend began, the model of the charismatic, self-made leader who commands by intellect and will, not by birth. It showed that in a post-revolutionary world, power could come from merit and myth combined, a new kind of authority that blended Enlightenment reason with theatrical spectacle. It effectively transformed Napoleon from military leader to national saviour. And it's this victory that David's Napoleon Crossing the Alps celebrates. Not the literal crossing, but the myth of the unstoppable hero who brings order through triumph. An Arabian stallion rears up, its mane swirling wildly in the wind. The powerful beast is wild-eyed, nostrils flared, straining with energy. Epic scenery and breathtaking cloud formations in the background speak of drama and adventure. In the distance, we glimpse French troops hauling a cannon, while a French tricolore flaps in the wind. But most of the picture is devoted to the horse and its rider. On this magnificent beast sits a figure in total command. The horse is as much a symbol as the man. Wild, muscular, barely contained, the embodiment of power harnessed by will. The reins are taut, the rider unshaken. That tension between chaos and composure defines the painting. Nature in turmoil, reason triumphant. It's a philosophical image, the Enlightenment spirit conquering the forces of disorder. The wind takes his cape in a dramatic swirl, but Napoleon remains unfazed, one arm aloft with a gloveless hand pointing onwards, towards the mountain he is about to pass, and the battle we know he will win. Everything points onwards and upwards, the torso of the horse, the cape, the pointing arm, the horse's tail, all echo the sweep of the mountain. Napoleon meets our eye with a steely gaze as he sits astride the horse with complete composure. This is a man in control. The trouble is, it never happened. Napoleon did cross the Alps to the Battle of Marengo, and he did win a decisive victory. But he travelled days later than the main force, and he wasn't riding a stallion. Rather, he was riding a mule, led along a narrow track by a guide, as this painting by Paul de la Roche shows. David knew this. He even asked Napoleon if he wanted to be shown realistically. Napoleon replied, "No, nobody will believe it." David didn't care, and neither did Napoleon. This was never meant to be fact. It was not a record of events, but a portrait of destiny, power, and heroism. Napoleon made the task even harder by refusing to pose. David had managed to persuade Napoleon to sit for a portrait 2 years earlier, but the fidgety and impatient Bonaparte didn't give him enough time to produce a decent likeness. It explains why Napoleon's features vary in different versions of the painting done by David and his assistants. He borrowed Napoleon's coat and hat worn at Marengo and used them for accuracy. David considered showing him in the middle of the battle, but in the end, Napoleon dictated the brief. He wanted to be shown calm on a fiery horse. It was a good call. For inspiration, David turned to Etienne Falconet's statue of Peter the Great in St. Petersburg, a vision of a powerful and awe-inspiring ruler. David knew the tradition he was working in well. Equestrian portraits had always signalled power. Titian painted Charles V at the Battle of Mühlberg, linking the Holy Roman Emperor to ancient Rome. Velázquez echoed this in his Equestrian Kings. David picked up the same thread, placing Napoleon in a lineage of conquerors stretching back to antiquity. The difference is, this is a modern general who conquers by reason and charisma, not by divine right. Look at the rocks in the painting. Alongside Bonaparte, David included two more names carved into the stones, Hannibal and Charlemagne. Both had crossed the Alps, both were immortalized as legendary leaders. Napoleon was now joining their ranks. On the breastplate yoke of the horse, the picture is signed and dated. The commission for the painting originally came from Charles IV of Spain. It was part of a diplomatic exercise to solidify an alliance between Spain and France. The painting was destined for his palace in Madrid, but Napoleon was so enamored by the painting he ordered 3 more versions. A 5th remained in David's studio until his death. Some critics say the painting is cold, remote, or lacks psychological depth. But that misses the point. David was not painting Napoleon the man, he was painting Napoleon the idea. Heroic, mythic, and larger than life. The painting wasn't a portrait of a man, it was about showcasing power and giving it legitimacy. And it worked. Napoleon's image became inseparable from this vision of the conquering hero, adored and feared in equal measure. A general who within 5 years of this battle would snatch the crown from the Pope and crown himself emperor. This was propaganda at its most powerful. Not literal truth, but a truth people desperately wanted to believe. When Napoleon's empire collapsed in 1815, David's loyalty cost him dearly. He refused to serve the restored Bourbon monarchy, and so, as Napoleon was forcibly exiled to St. Helena, David went into voluntary exile in Brussels. He told friends, "I have glorified the emperor, I will not paint kings." Struck by a carriage in 1824, he never fully recovered. A year later, after catching a chill outside a theatre, he died in Brussels, aged 77. Jacques-Louis David was a man of contradictions. Swept up in France's most turbulent era, he was a revolutionary idealist turned extremist, a servant of empire, a propagandist, and above all, a master painter. Through classical, idealized forms, he helped create new political myths. His works reveal how images don't just reflect reality, but can also shape and distort it. Napoleon Crossing the Alps is a perfect example. Not literal truth, but a portrait of belief, ambition, and control. Whatever one thinks of his work, it forces us to ask, when does storytelling become manipulation? When does an image turn into a weapon? And how much does context define meaning?